This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. I'm Pastor Ben. This video is the second in our series, The Stories of the Resurrection. Last video was looking at the Gospels, and I think the stories most people associate with the resurrection, which is, say, Jesus appearing on the walk to Emmaus, or Jesus appearing to Mary in the garden, or Jesus appearing to the disciples from the fire and eating fish, or Jesus on the lake shore in the Gospel of John, or Jesus appearing to Thomas. Those are the things people tend to think of. But this series will go farther. What about those other spaces where the resurrected Jesus does show up in the New Testament after those scenes? And what we're really talking about here is after the ascension of Jesus into heaven. Those other stories are before the ascension into heaven. Then after the ascension, the resurrected Jesus is not absent, but does show up. And we're going to look at a few of those stories. I think the most famous one is the one we're going to talk about today. That is the experience Paul has on the road to Damascus that sometimes is called his conversion, sometimes called his call. We're going to talk about it. One thing I just want to say really fast, just because it's kind of a personal pet peeve of mine, is that the name of this fellow, Saul and Paul, there's a lot of people who have hypothesized that Paul changes his name at this conversion experience. I just want to say real fast, there's no evidence for that. In fact, in Acts chapter 9, he's called Saul. He continues being called Saul for several more chapters until he goes into Gentile lands and he starts using a Greek name, Paul. It was very common for people to have two names, one Jewish, one Aramaic, and one Greek. And so that's almost certainly what's happening, just the same way that there's Didymus, who's Thomas, and they both mean twin, one in Aramaic, one in Greek. So that's just a little personal thing because people have made all kinds of things about that, and I don't see any evidence of that. Paul in his letters never calls himself Saul at all, which of course he's writing in Greek to Greek audiences. So it's most likely he just has two names, and he's always had two names. There's no big thing about it changing. But back to the topic, not my own little sidebar. Now, considering the resurrection appearance to Paul, there's actually several accounts, but there's two main ones. One is in Acts chapter 9, and one is in Galatians chapter 1 and 2. I will say there actually are two more accounts in Acts, where Acts chapter 9 is where we see the scene of the resurrected Jesus showing up. And then in chapters 26 and 28, Paul tells the story to different audiences. For our purposes in this video, we're just going to look at Acts chapter 9. And what I want to do is to look at what is this revelation? What is this story of the resurrection? Well, it's kind of interesting because this is after Jesus' ascension, that there's pieces that you probably know pretty well here, especially in this version. Paul is headed to Damascus, and when on the way, and he's there in order to take letters to the synagogue for the putting down of this new Jesus movement, and on the way, a great light flashes. And the flashing is an important point. It's a moving thing. Something's happening. It's not just entering into a space of light, but it's like a shocking, there's movement involved. And then it is a resurrection appearance of Jesus, but it's only a voice. This is very interesting because this voice comes and says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Saul says, who are you, Lord? And he says, I am Jesus, whom you're persecuting. And this is odd. Normally, when we hear about a seemingly like a voice from heaven, we often associate that with God the Creator, but here it's simply a voice. Now, Paul does not say he ever sees Jesus. Now, there's a couple possible reasons. One is it might just be the voice, or the other might be because of this light flashing. It says he falls down to the ground. So perhaps that the embodied Jesus is there, or it might just be the voice. It's not clear. It doesn't tell us. But it's this voice that comes, and this is this resurrection story. Famously, Paul goes blind from this interaction. And the directions, by the way, from this voice says, is after self-identifying, it simply says, go to Damascus, where you were going anywhere, and be told. Find out what's going to happen for you next. That's all. That's all the content that's there. And Jesus doesn't appear again to Paul in this narrative. He's just going to go and be told. And so he does. He goes to Damascus. And then meanwhile, the character Ananias, who lives in Damascus, who's a follower of Jesus, has his own resurrection vision. And in this one, he's given this very specific instruction. We don't have this big thing about who are you, Lord, and all of that. Instead, it's like a specific instruction to go meet Saul on Straight Street and to welcome him into this new movement. Ananias doesn't want to do it. He's heard of this guy. Paul is not so sure about it. And but he does. And then Ananias comes, touches Paul, something like scales fall from his eyes. He can now see. And then Saul is baptized. And then immediately Saul begins proclaiming the message of this new Jesus. And he starts causing problems because people don't like it. And it says they start plotting to kill him, so they send him away from Damascus. And he ends up in Jerusalem, where they're not so sure about him, because after all, this was just a direct revelation. But then Barnabas, who we meet many times, vouches for Paul. And there in Jerusalem, it's they, and he starts causing problems, community thing. They, in Jerusalem, send Paul to the nations. This is the story in Acts. So you see, what's the resurrection appearance? It's this voice, and the message is simply go be told. And there's an undergirded figure in charge of this whole thing of the Spirit driving all of this. Baptized, receiving the Spirit. Ananias receiving the Spirit. The Spirit moving Paul to begin proclaiming. But the resurrection appearance gets it started. Now, that's the story in Acts. Now, if you turn to Galatians 1 and 2, the emphasis is really different. One is this is Paul telling his own story, and he wants to say that it is not from human, it's not from human origin. His gospel is not from a human origin, but he received it through a revelation. He doesn't call it a resurrection appearance. Acts does that. He calls it a revelation. And in that revelation, he emphasizes it's the God who set me apart before I was born. But one emphasis, it's the God he's always known, who set him apart before he was born. And says, and revealed his Son to me. Actually, it says, revealed his Son in me. And so the revelation of Jesus comes from, we might call God the Creator. And this time, the narrative is specifically, he does not go up to Jerusalem. He says, well, later, 3 years later, I did, but only met a couple of people. And then only later yet went 14 years later. So we have a very different kind of emphasis in this passage. And what's interesting here is, if you're curious, at the beginning I said some people call it a conversion, some people a call. This is more like a conversion. A person who's going to persecute a movement joins the movement. Here, this is more like a call. A person who believes in the God they always believed in has now revealed his Son, and actually with a purpose. It says, to proclaim his gospel to the nations. Another word for nation, Gentile. To the Gentiles. And that's the revelation that he got from God. It is a mission. It's a purpose. It's instructing Paul to do something. Here, it is more a causing him to stop and causing him to evaluate and challenge everything he knows and go the other direction. It doesn't use the word repentance, but you almost wonder there, turn around and go the other direction. There's kind of that idea. That's why it's historically been called a conversion. And so there's definitely a different emphasis, and the appearance has a voice, and yet it's still a resurrection appearance of Jesus. This is an important development in the book of Acts of saying, how is Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, which is to say the one that exists now, how is this Jesus still present? Well, one is through the activity of the Spirit, and the Spirit is kind of driving this whole narrative. But the other is that, no, Jesus does still arrive, sometimes in these dramatic ways. Or if you turn over here, well, what's a revelation? Well, you can take that many ways. Was this simply an insight? Well, it sounds like it's more than that. And we're going to look next time at another vision that Paul seems to have that is much more dramatic, more like this. But it's much more open as well, that Jesus is present, but in different ways than we might have expected. Very different than the kind of resurrection appearances before the ascension, as we looked at in our previous video. So this series is just going to begin looking at, how does Jesus continue to be revealed in the New Testament after the ascension, and give us some clues on what that might mean for us as 21st century Christians who are also thinking about, in what way is Jesus remaining present after the ascension, the period we live in today. So look forward to more videos looking at further topics or further components on this topic. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.